Hey everyone, it's Charlie O'Donnell with Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. I'm excited to pick back up in our lunchtime StackUp series. Today we're going to be talking about design. It's been a little while since we've had a good design StackUp. And so I'm going to bring up Tom, who I think just needs to turn on his video and audio to be able to present.
Okay.
And cool, awesome. And Tom is at Rho, and of course, when people think of high quality design, the first thing they think about are banks. And so, I'm super curious to hear what you're going to share about why this is so important to you, and especially given a product that, like, frankly, most people don't normally associate with good design. So I really appreciate that, and I'm going to find this super interesting.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I'll leave you to it and get out of your way.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Charlie.
No problem.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so as Charlie said, my name is Tom. I'm the VP of Product Design at Rho. And I'm going to talk about a few things today. I'll kind of share my screen and walk through, but not just specifically related to design, but sort of from a larger perspective about team building and how to actually, leverage these different teams that you have in the structures in order to build a product that ultimately serves the customers best. So give me just a second to get my screen pop up here, and we'll do this. All right. So as you can see, I am Tom Treadway. This is me in my younger years here. And without further ado, let's jump in. So just to talk a little bit about my background, about who I am to kind of frame this context. I'm originally from Seattle. I spent a long time living and working there. I've worked in San Francisco, I've worked in Germany, and I've worked in Switzerland. And so part of the reason we're going to talk about what I'm going to talk about today is because over the years, kind of working across a number of different sort of cultures and environments and on different sort of structured teams, I've really become fascinated with sort of the parameters by which you can build a team and how that ultimately affects how you can build a product, right? The sort of working environment and the type of collaboration you may have in a country like Germany may be entirely different than something that you'll get in San Francisco or in Switzerland, for example. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, is kind of how that makes a difference in terms of the teams that and the products that you're building. So this is just to give you some context. These are some of the companies and the teams that I've worked on in the past. I've done, bigger projects and sort of exploratory projects with teams like Amazon and Microsoft. I've worked at Apple, some smaller companies like General Assembly and Filson and Huge. And so all of this is to say that, like, I've had tons of experience working on teams of all different sizes with all different approaches. And so we'll talk about some of the buzzwords, whether it's, waterfall or agile, some of these team methodologies, and talk about how they apply to Rho and how we actually use them to build great products that our customers love. And so that brings us to where we are now. I've done all those things for such a long time, and now I'm currently serving as the VP of Product Design at Rho. And off of kind of what Charlie said, part of the reason I wanted to join Rho is because banking is not typically thought of as sort of a high bar for design and for user experience. And truthfully, that's where I find kind of the most opportunity and the most exciting opportunities, is to take sort of an afterthought of an industry or of an experience and really elevate that and bring it to where it should be. So as far as today's agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about design. I'll talk about Rho just so you have some context, and then talk about the different approaches to building teams, and then how we actually use that internally at Rho to create great experiences for our customers. So to start off, like, just talking about design, right? What does that mean? And design means a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? So it may mean interaction design, where you're talking about, the states of a button. What does it look like when you hover or when you press something? Maybe it's something more related to user experience. So what does it look like when you go through a flow? In this example of, maybe I'm trying to link my bank accounts. What does that sort of flow look like? That starts to get into things like animation and motion design. Maybe it's more art direction in the way you think of it. Like, what does the front-facing sort of impression of my brand look like to my customers? How do I sort of create this emotive expression for my brand? But the reality is, like, good design is so much more than that. And I always like to think of it from this perspective that good design is really just good strategy made visual. And what that means is that good strategy starts with what we call human-centered design. And so the reality is that it's about building a deep empathy with the people that you're designing for. You can't just go in and make something look beautiful and throw it out there, because at the end of the day, you know, in the 21st century where we are, and given the sort of bar for user experience, your product will ultimately always fail. So it's about involving so much more than just how it looks and the output of the design, but actually how you approach design and where you're sort of coming at it from. Now, I like to present this sort of this visual because we refer to this as like the M-shaped maker's toolkit. And while a lot of people will typically think of design as sort of the output, so the interaction design, the user experience, animations, as sort of a design responsibility, the reality is that it looks something a lot more like this, right? So we involve thinking, there's research, there's products, so working on a roadmap, strategy. This green column is actually some of those things we looked at, and those are the output of design, right? So user experience, interaction, visual design. But it involves so much more than that, all the way through to leadership, involving data, development, storytelling, and learning. So the scope and the responsibility of a designer and the design team is so much more broad than specifically just delivering on some of these visual executions. Now, what I'm going to talk about in just a little bit is that you're probably thinking, yes, you know, some of these responsibilities should fall on other members of the team. And that's kind of a point that we'll get to, is that design is really involving the entire team. It's not just a matter of the designers executing on one part. So to take a step back before we go into how design is applied at Rho, I'll give you some context about who we are. So we are sort of a modern fintech. We see ourselves as generally a platform that gives you the service tools and capitals to change the way your business can operate in the 21st century. We like to think of ourselves from this approach as helping your team work better together at money, with money. Now, banking and finance is typically thought of as sort of like a single player game where you have sort of like one channel in, one channel out, usually someone on the finance team, whether it's the CFO or the accountant. But that's really not the way that modern teams work today. And so we're trying to leverage that in order to help teams work better together. Now, we sort of see ourselves as twofold as well. We have sort of a software arm where we offer some things like innovation. We work on sort of cutting edge features. We're very user experience and digital driven. Now, on the other side, we provide all of the core banking stuff that you'd get at a typical institution. So things like transfers, deposits, service, capital, and cash back. So we look at ourselves as sort of a layer of cutting edge software on top of sort of banking rails and infrastructure, which ultimately allow us to operate a lot faster and to develop features and to create a much better user experience than any typical banking institution could. And so to give you an idea of what that kind of looks like from a feature set perspective, these are some of the things we offer. So checking and treasury accounts, FDIC insurance, corporate cards, virtual cards, fee-free transfers, accounts payable. I'm not going to read through all of these things, but you start to get an idea for like the pretty broad scope of some of the things that, you know, we cover. It's a giant platform with tons of benefits for tons of different businesses because we have lots of different use cases. So making sure that we can address all of those is kind of key to us. So, you know, given both of those things, about who I am, what design is, and what Rho is. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about how does design fit into the larger perspective at Rho. So it goes without saying, obviously, design is you know, the most important role in the universe. Just kidding, but the reality is that like design, in terms of how we see it, is that it's really sort of the pivotal point around which all of the other roles kind of can operate and sort of overlap between each other, right? So we look at design, and I look at design specifically as sort of this sort of pivot point, which we can involve all other aspects of the business. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different team structures and how that works in just a second here. But on a day-to-day basis, we do a lot of different things at Rho in terms of an executionary standpoint. We run through workshops and help people ideate and understand all the different touch points of a flow a customer may have. We work on design systems, so making sure that we create components that are consistent across the different platforms, whether it's mobile or web, or even down to something like an email drip campaign. We make sure that all of our brand touch points are consistent through design systems. We work on prototyping, so making sure that we can take and test our designs with users, get it in front of them, and validate our ideas as we're sort of going through this. We obviously work on web design too, and even marketing materials. And so you can start to see sort of the wide array of sort of deliverables that design covers. And this crosses tons of different departments, like I like we saw in that graphic, right? It's not just sort of the interactive side of things. We involve customer service, we involve sales, we involve strategy. Everything is sort of involved in this. And last but not least, product design. So this is kind of the core of what we do, right? So, this is just one facet of what we do, is building the actual product, but it's important for us to sort of take into consideration all these other elements and touch points for the brand as we're going through design. Now, when you want to talk about building your team, there's a few different ways that you can sort of approach this. And this is going to take a step back and get a little bit psychological here, or philosophical, if you will. But there's obviously tons of different ways that you can approach, building and structuring your team that's right for your product. Of course, there's functional teams, which is typically what would be referred to as like a waterfall approach. And it's generally reserved for sort of more established, regulated products. Functional teams are usually most common where, everybody's working together for a solid goal, but they're responsible for their own sort of department. Now, on the other side, there's this, what we call self-organized, which is probably what you would understand as like the typical startup, where they refer to it as wearing a lot of hats. So this is kind of for teams that are usually from 6 to 8, where, you kind of just need to adjust and move on the fly to be able to accommodate, whatever needs to be done at the moment. It can get a bit crazy, which is why generally teams that are under, 6 to 8 people, it's best suited for a team size like that. Now, cross-functional, which is kind of what I'm going to talk about as it applies to Rho, is a blend between two of those things, right? Where team members from all these different functional areas have shared commitments. The ultimate goal is that everybody views the work as not just specific to their department, but actually the group goal and what needs to be done or delivered for the product as a whole. This means that every team is interdependent and is interdisciplinary in reality. So in terms of the implementation of how we actually apply cross-functional teams, the truth is that it's not magic, right? It's not something that you just say, okay, we're going to work cross-functionally. We'll take one of you, one of you, one of you, and put them together. There's a lot of parameters and sort of guidelines you need to put in place to actually make sure that it's done correctly. And so I find this quote actually pretty interesting. So Harvard Business Review did a detailed study from 25 leading corporations and actually found that nearly 75% of those teams were dysfunctional. So these were teams who had heard this buzzword of working cross-functionally and tried to implement it in their own organization, and it wasn't working well. And so you probably wonder why. And these teams struggled on quite a few different things. So meeting planned budgets, staying on schedule, adhering to specifications, meeting expectations, and maintaining alignment. With so many people from so many different teams, it becomes exceptionally hard to be able to manage those things and to keep the, so to speak, everybody rowing in the same direction. So there's a few things that you can do and that these cross-functional teams require in order to be successful. The first is what we call like a PGT team, so portfolio governance. And what this means, it's kind of a trendy buzzword, but what this really means is that you need a high stakeholder who's involved in making sure that they are also thinking cross-functionally and they're responsible for overseeing the executions of the team. The second is you need an accountable leader to make sure everybody's sort of rowing in the right direction. It requires clear goals, resources, and deadlines. And the main thing is that everybody needs to be on board believing that the project success is the main objective. It's not about my KPIs as a designer or as an engineer, making sure I deliver my work and then be hands off. Ultimately, the success in the KPIs should look like success for the entire project, which everyone contributes to. Now, the last two, continual reevaluation, is sort of self-explanatory, to sort of reevaluate and make sure that on a sprint by sprint basis, you're still going in the right direction. And then shared KPIs across the team is sort of a parlay from number 4, which is that everybody has sort of a shared objective and that we're steering in the same direction. Now, pulling this back, right, it's not just a matter of structure and process that you put in place, but it even comes down to, on a very abstract basis, like the type of personality traits that you want to hire for your team, right? And so there's two different types here, right? There's functional social, which is typically someone who believes that the success of others is dependent on your own success. And so this means if I'm an engineer, I identify with the role of being an engineer within the larger organization. I understand how me being an engineer contributes to us delivering and succeeding with this product. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have personal social, which is the belief that the success of an individual's functional role is more important than making sure the entire team is meeting the qualifications of success. So to use that same engineering metaphor, it would be me identifying with being an engineer as opposed to sort of the layer above, which is identifying with the role of an engineer on the team, right? And so really what you want to aim for is building a functional social team. So people who identify as understanding that their role contributes to a larger goal so that everybody is contributing. If you focus on the alternative and hire too many people, we tend to refer to as like the Kobe Bryant types, you'll get a lot of people sort of pulling in opposite directions. And so, this is all to say that like building a cross-functional team really has to be believed from sort of the bottom up as well as led from the top down to make sure that everybody sort of embraces this. It's not a matter of, adjusting something to a 2-week sprint schedule or doing whatever sort of, explicit optics schedule changes that look like. It's a matter of sort of like really believing in the process and sort of owning those traits. Now, all of this is to say that, like, how does cross-functional come into play at Rho, and how does, it actually help us on a day-to-day basis? And so I'll touch on a few of these things. Like many businesses, we have a number of challenges that we try to sort of take on, or that we try to overcome on a regular basis, right? We have specific to us external challenges, like, our clients have multiple stakeholders. We are a B2B sales company with a B2C end user. So how do we make sure that we address the issues from a high level, but also satisfy a very specific end user? We may be selling to accounting or CFOs, but we actually have to address concerns for each individual role on the team and make sure that we are solving for problems for all of them. We have different values across varying industries or team sizes. Of course, the needs of a 1 to 2 person mom and pop shop business may be completely different from sort of like in 100 person, Series A, Series B startup that's scaling fast. So how do we make sure that we're able to sort of keep up to speed and understand the different variety of challenges with each one of these clients? Now, internally, these are more broad and not things specific to Rho, but companies have to overcome challenges like knowledge guarding. So especially in niche industries like banking or finance, where people have a lot of domain knowledge, they may not want to give up that information because it's exceptional to their experience, and it lets them be seen as a valuable employee. You may have department specific KPIs where sales may have one objective, where engineering may have another. There may be confusion on the vision of the entire team. You may have competing priorities, as well as like role responsibilities and understanding, hey, where does my role and the responsibilities I have cut off versus where does this get handed off to someone else? And so all of these things kind of put together are things that can be solved by cross-functional team structures when done correctly. So for us, working cross-functionally lets us overcome some of those obstacles. The first of which is knowledge sharing, right? So on our team, not everybody comes from a banking background. Some of us are designers, some of us are engineers, and other of us are, come from banking institutions and traditional sort of finance backgrounds that contain a lot of domain knowledge. So for us, building a cross-functional team really allows us to cross-examine the products we build and overcome knowledge guarding. So everybody is involved from the first stage of the product development, making sure that the designers have all of the information needed through our product requirement documents to understand what the use case is for a client and what the pain points are, so they can really paint a good picture. The second is innovation. Ideating across multiple perspectives really enables us to think of like innovative solutions and approaches that a specific department may not consider on its own. I think having a diverse group of people from age, background, and thoughts definitely brings new innovation to the table in a way that allows us to move faster than like a typical finance institution can, right? We're able, and I think that's truthfully the strength of Rho in terms of the design and the team we're building, is this diverse school of thought that we are able to bring together, so we can actually kind of, not just iterate on existing solutions, whether it's taking something from, a sort of a very solid existing flow, whether it's creating a debit card or sending money somewhere. We can sort of build this from scratch and think about it from the user's perspective and build the best user experience possible. Obviously, it allows us to have shared vision and direction. By involving everyone from the different teams, everyone understands the strength of each other's teams. So, when sales meets engineering, they understand the efforts of the teams, and they're able to sort of take advantage of their knowledge. You start sharing these common goals and foster a bit of understanding on the team that's ultimately good for the business and helps things move faster in the long run. And of course, you can resolve competing priorities. A cross-functional team will help eliminate most, if not all, of the conflicting priorities and knowledge gaps, so everybody's on the same page. The goal is, to remind you that everybody's working in the same direction towards the same KPI. And so this helps us, so everybody on a cross-functional team is working in that right direction and ultimately building towards the same thing. And last but not least, but like increased engagement is a really important thing, right? It may seem like inefficient to have, a UX designer sitting in on early meetings where you're discussing strategy and scope and customer audience, but these things are sort of the foundation that build great context as the project moves forward. So there's not anyone who needs to be sort of onboarded later on in the project. Everybody throughout the team has the entire scope or sort of the breadth of information that's needed to get the job done as things go on, which allow them to sort of think and forecast a little bit ahead. So that's kind of it about Rho, how we use design, how we work on a day-to-day basis. But if there's a few things that I want you to sort of take away from this, it's that, look, cross-functional teams are great, but they're not a magic solution. It's a framework and not a blueprint that really needs to be worked on both from the bottom up and believed by the employees and sort of led from the top down by sort of leadership who sets the example of how that should work. On the other side, when things are done correctly, working cross-functionally creates a stronger idea generation and more in-depth understanding of some of these complex problems. So for a company like Rho that is relatively niche with these very specific problems, working cross-functionally can really unlock some of those problems and let you solve them. And the last thing is that, look, it's got to be done carefully and very strategically in order to be done well. So, again, parlaying from the first point, it's not a magic solution, but it really can help companies build strong products that are really built from the customer's perspective when done correctly. And that's it.
Cool. So I have a bunch of questions. First of all, I'm super fascinated by the periodic table of M, or the M chart, and I'm just
Sure.
That's something that you guys created, or is that something that is like out in the design community?
It's something that's out in the design community. It was not something that we created. I believe actually it originally came from Microsoft and some of the perspectives that they have on design. And really what this is sort of a graphic that tries to inspire this sort of design-led organization and represent that, design has impact in all of these different disciplines, and all of these other sort of roles that you would think of on a typical team are also involved in design.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm gonna check that out and see if I can find that and sort of make that available.
Sure.
I'm really fascinated by the idea of role-based, the idea that I am doing a role in the organization versus I am that position. I am playing the role of an engineer versus like I am an engineer, and how it potentially makes people more flexible on what they're asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you have good ways of vetting for people's comfortability with on the hiring side, or is that something that you think most people are up for and it's just a way that you manage?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of both, right? Like, it's a bit of a personality trait that you kind of just have to do a gut check on. And ultimately, it's about having conversations that allow you. I mean, it's an interview, it's an hour. And so sometimes 2 or 3, but it's not forever to get to understand somebody and really, their inner personalities. But it's a bit of both, is trying to gauge and understand, what their perspective is, how they've collaborated in past work environments. And I think that's helpful, is to really understand what type of working environments they've been in the past. Because if, it's someone who has come from large organizations, they may be more familiar with a waterfall-based approach. But that's not to say that someone who hasn't worked in that environment can't be sort of kind of nudged in the right direction to follow this new team structure. So it's a bit of both, of kind of doing some groundwork to understand someone's susceptibility to be involved in sort of a collaborative environment like that, and then sort of kind of guiding them, every step of the way. And that's what I mean when I talked about sort of needing some advice from the top down, or sort of some leading, if you will, from your leadership team, is that it needs to be represented that this is how we work and this is the correct way to do things, so that the team does feel supported to work in that fashion, right? If you imagine if leadership is telling everyone, okay, you're going to work cross-functionally, but they themselves are only responsible or focused on doing what they need to for their role, no one is really going to embody those beliefs, and it's going to be very difficult to find success.
Gotcha. Also, I want to think about this from a team construction place. I'm curious, like, how many people were in the organization when you joined Rho? Have you been there since from the beginning?
I have, yeah. I think there was about 5 or 6 of us when I initially joined. We're about 45 now. I think around 50.
Okay. And I wonder if you were to sort of go out and look at sort of full-time design employees and just map out what number employee they tend to be, it's probably later than 6 on average. What case would you make to founders as they are thinking about their organizations as to why they should think about full-time design hires and how they should think about building that team out versus what I tend to think happens a lot of times is it goes to it gets outsourced or consulting or all of that sort of stuff. Sometimes very talented folks, but just who aren't part of the team.
Yeah. So, I mean, my advice would always be generally to think of your first design hire as someone who is not a specialty designer, right? I mean, design is a very broad field with tons of different disciplines. So it's important to understand that, like, it's what you want out of your first hire in terms of starting your design team is someone who has a broad skill set and who can work across these disciplines until you're either able to sort of find market fit or grow the team a little bit further and start to fill in some of, excuse me, those specialty roles. Because if you do get someone who does focus in, say, product design, you're going to suffer on the marketing side. Now, you can, of course, go and outsource your product to another company, but at some point, you're still going to have to make that move back to transitioning to an in-house design team. So yeah, I would say the earlier you can start that, the better, because it does take time to onboard designers, to understand the brand, the audience, the product, and to get them up to speed to be able to sort of really run with that. So just to kind of summarize, I would really say start with a broad designer with a broad skill set who can kind of cover product, marketing, and brand just a little bit, enough to get you off the ground until you can really start to fill in some of those roles and hire across the specific product and brand teams.
And do you think most people, most designers would prefer to perhaps be at least part of it from the beginning, even on a part-time basis, so they don't come in with brand work and all of that, somebody else's brand work sort of already done?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I can only really speak for myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say, yeah, for myself, yes, definitely. That's part of the reason I wanted to join Rho and get in as early as I could, because I do think that's the fun part is really, getting that groundwork in and to having, an impact on every aspect of the product from the brand, and ultimately, I think, I'm speaking in generalizations, but most designers want to have a really large impact on the products they work on, right? It's not so fun sometimes to go to a big company like Google or Facebook and work on, like, the search bar for months on end before you deliver something. I think most people generally would like to see sort of the end results of the work that they do. And the truth is, the earlier you get on a product, the more you can see sort of the fruits of your labor. But of course, I can't speak for everybody. Some people are very specialty designers and they like focusing on, if it's specifically animation or motion or sort of micro interactions. There's sort of a job out there for everybody. But if that is the case, I would probably not suggest joining an early stage startup because you're going to be quite frustrated by the variety of tasks you have to deliver on.
Well, and to that point, and one last question I'll ask, I notice we're keying in on time here, is that you made the point that your first full-time design hire is not going to be a specialist because they're going to be asked to do sort of a lot of different things. That being said, and maybe you could comment on your own case, because I'm not sure if you were to talk about a thing that you had previously specialized in or where your background came from.
Mm-hmm.
There's always that balance when you're making the first full-time hire in a functional area where you're like, okay, there's only 5 of us at the company. I need somebody to literally do the brand mark, or I need somebody to do this specific specialized thing. And there's the worry that somebody who's more senior or more of a generalist won't either A, want to do some of those things, or B, they're maybe like a little out of practice on it. On the flip side, you may take somebody who's a specialist and they don't know it holistically. So like,
Right.
how do you balance that in the first time hire? Like,
Yeah. So truthfully, that's a very kind of dynamic question. There's a
mm-hmm.
lot of layers to it, and I can try and unpack a few. I think to your first point, I think what's important is to find somebody who does want to function as an individual contributor. You're too early stage to find somebody who's sort of a strategist and a team builder. That person can come eventually, of course, and you'll need them at some point. But and in an ideal world, you'll get somebody who is at that level who still misses, getting their hands dirty and sort of putting rubber to the pavement and working as an individual contributor on a day-to-day basis. So I would say you're either on the cusp, maybe who's been in a senior role, who's looking to take a step forward to that leadership role that will develop with time as they come to know the product and the business and the brand a little bit better. So you're looking for that, and you're also looking for someone who I think is self-aware enough to understand, where their strong suit is, right? Even if for generalists, you have some specific area that maybe is your strong suit. And so being able to recognize that and sort of hire or even staff freelancers or outsource small bits of the product or the brand where necessary is really important for you to sort of understand it. That's something I've worked a lot with our co-founder Alex, who's been great as a mentor towards me, is sort of helping me understand where sort of my weak spots and my strong suits are, and helping me not to like point out where the flaws are, but to help me sort of work on some of these sort of flex points where I can sort of outsource to hire a freelancer who's maybe a bit better at illustration or motion or branding. And so that's kind of how we're looking about building the brand team as well, or the design team as a whole, is filling in some of these strengths, or filling in to build some of these strengths on the team where maybe those are general skill sets for me.
Gotcha. Cool. And before we let you go, obviously, our audience generally tends to be sort of startup-y, early stage company. What's the quick pitch for Rho? Like, should we be Rho customers?
Yeah, you should definitely be Rho customers. That's not to say that we're for everybody, but typically we work well for teams that are trying to scale and grow fast. So we're an affordable banking institution that will kind of blow every other typical banking institution out of the water. So if you're looking for an all-in-one platform that helps you sort of run your business from cards to accounts to accounting all in one place for an affordable price, the platform is free and we're always open. So you can find us at Rho.co, and we'll get you set up as quickly as possible.
Cool. Thanks so much for spending time with us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, Charlie. Thanks for the talk.
No problem.